I have 36 books I need to wrap up that I haven't made wrap-up videos for, and that's what I'm going to be trying to do today, but I probably won't be able to get through all 36 of them, so we'll see. Hi, and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. My name is Sunny, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in February, March, and April, but more likely, probably just the ones I read in, like, February. And you'll see my March, April, and May wrap-ups later, most likely. Someone commented on my January wrap-up video. Wow, I had to check the date before I watched this. I'm like, yeah, unfortunately that's what happens. You film a January wrap-up and then you post it 5 months later, that's just how it goes. Let's just start talking about the stuff that I read in February. The first book I finished in February, my Goodreads is pulled up right here, so, and you can friend me on Goodreads if you'd like. Just put in the challenge question how you found me, and my Goodreads link is always below. Oh, and also you should join my bindery for bonus content. I ranked and gave honorable mention titles for all the books that I read in 2023. I did a video recommending books based off of Black Mirror, and yeah, just like bonus stuff like that. Check it out. $5 a month, and it also helps contribute to building a community where we can potentially start publishing books underneath in my own bindery imprint. So, anyways, the first book that I want to talk about is The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On by Franny Choi. It's a poetry collection, Franny Choi's latest. I think I've read most of Franny Choi's poetry at this point, and honestly my attachment to her writing comes more from the fact that when I was like in high school, I got really into watching like button poetry videos and she came up and I thought that a lot of her stuff was really good, and so I don't know, I have like a loyalty to her from those years. And yeah, I thought this was fine. I rated it 3.5 stars. I think that there's a sort of like voice that contemporary poets all kind of hold on. It's weird. It's a sort of particular cadence and theming and type of work that is involved, and it can feel a little uniform after a while, and it's why I don't necessarily read that much contemporary poetry or poetry in general. It's just not really my thing. But I thought this was like readable, and it really touches on these ideas of, her relationship with like work. I think she's like a visiting lecturer or a teacher at a university or something, and capitalism and race and gender, all these things, of course. And yeah, I thought it was solid, but nothing necessarily to write home about. Then I read Luster by Leilani, finally, years after everyone was talking about it and recommending it. Oh, also, forgive the background noise, including the cicadas. I probably said this in my last video too, but it's really crazy right now. Like, these cicadas are wild. They're so loud. You step outside and you just feel like bugs are shrieking at you, I swear to God. Anyways, Luster by Leilani is a contemporary novel that follows this black woman who lives in New York City, works at a publishing house, but then gets fired within the first few chapters. She's also a painter. That's like her passion. But then she ends up getting involved in this married man's life by like having an affair with him. But he and his wife have like an open relationship. They live out in the nice suburbs. And then she ends up kind of living with them in a weird way. And this like nice older white couple that she inserts herself into the life of, they have an adopted black child, a little girl, and so we kind of see the relationship between her, our main character, who's this like disaffected, wandering 20 or 30 something, and this child who is feeling really, lost and isolated, and is like quirky in the way that children are. So I thought the writing for this was kind of lush at points, and it also is really sad. Like, it's a really somber type of language that speaks to all these different daily little things and minutia of life, and like suburban family drama, midlife crises, but also quarter life crises. It was really interesting, but I think that there was a sort of the darkness combined with the style of writing. I really thought it was interesting and compelling and somewhat sophisticated and unique in this sort of disaffected young woman genre of writing. I think that this book made me feel a lot of like dread and sadness, I guess, um, in a way that I was sucked into it, but I kind of like didn't want to be. So yeah, I rated it 3.5 stars. Then I read the book Black Girl, You Are Atlas by Renee Watson. I rated this book 3 stars, and I'm pretty sure this is like a young adult novel told in verse, and I think that if I had read this book when I was younger, like in high school or something, I would have really enjoyed it. But I'm kind of not really the target demographic for this anymore, so as much as I can appreciate it for the writing and the storytelling, it's not something that I'm gonna be, a big fan of, like personally. And also, I think when I was in middle school, I read one of Renee Watson's books, and it was really moving, and I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, I know I would have really liked it had I read it when I was younger. It didn't really work for me now, but I do think it was pretty good. So, 3 stars. The next book that I read was Interesting Facts About Space by Emily Austen. And even though it was released on January 30th, I only read the arc that was so graciously sent to me by Emily Austen and her team in mid or early February. And with Emily Austen, I really loved her first book, Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead. I was really moved by it, and I think this book falls short of that for me personally, just on a level of like the material, mostly because this book follows a woman who is really obsessed with true crime and true crime podcasts, and it ratchets up her anxiety, and she has this sort of like fear or suspicion that someone is breaking into her house, and she also has this like fear of and fixation on bald men, and her girlfriend and her are kind of trying to work through the obvious mental health issues that our main character is going through, and our main character also at work has a work friend who's really concerned for her. And yeah, I thought that it felt very similar to Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead, and it just kind of swapped out some of the different things, some different aspects of these characters' lives in a way that still was compelling to me, and I didn't find it too like redundant necessarily. I wasn't too concerned with whether I thought it was like too similar to the previous book or not, because even comparing them, I didn't enjoy it as much as I liked the first one, but I still enjoyed it. I still thought that it was a really good time. I felt moved by these characters and the way that they were working to be better and help each other and all of their struggles. It felt sort of at points true to life and at other points like a clear exaggeration for effect, and yet it still existed within this sort of realistic contemporary fiction world that didn't feel too, I guess, like up its own ass, I guess. So it was a good read. I liked it. 4 stars. Then I read the book Out There Screaming, an anthology of new black horror edited by Jordan Peele. And I rated this 3 stars. I thought that a lot of the stories in this were kind of mediocre to uninteresting. Then there were a few that were like really good and really memorable. And of course, like that's kind of what happens with an anthology. There's all these different writers and all these different genres and perspectives, really, because this feels more like a speculative fiction collection and anthology rather than necessarily something that is very like horror and like a boo scaring you, dark things happening situation. It felt more like some of the stories, the inherent darkness and fear involved in fantastical and science fiction situations. I think some of my favorite stories in there, and I mentioned this in my Goodreads review, is I think the last story in the collection is called Origin Story by Tochi Onyebuchi. I thought that that was really interesting and cool. It has this sort of like meta thing. It's like meta. It's written in a play format, and there's these different characters named like White Boy 1, White Boy 2, White Boy 3, White Boy 4, and they're talking about their role in the literary canon as default figures, and they're contending with it, but in a humorous way that then gets very dark and weird. I thought that it was really interesting. Another story in here was Your Happy Place by Terrence Taylor. And that story does something really interesting with alternate realities and prison labor and abuse of power and systemic issues that are inherent to the prison industrial complex. I thought that it was really unsettling. Those were some of my favorites in there, but yeah, a lot of the other ones were not really that great. I even think the N.K. Jemisin story at the beginning of the anthology, it was interesting, but I kind of expected more, if that makes sense. Like, I think that N.K. Jemisin, some of her more recent work, with like The City We Became and this short story, she's really sort of working to put the reader into the role and the shoes of someone who is objectively a bad person. Like in this story, like a cop who sucks. And it's interesting because it kind of, in some ways, takes out the depth and the nuance that are what makes her writing on characters so interesting. Like, I mean, one of my favorite books of all time, The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, what's so compelling about that story is that all the perspectives that we're in and all the characters we're closest to as we follow, they're all there's something unclear about their motivations at times and their actions, and while the things that they do might be deplorable, there's always like a reason for it. And I think the ideological drive behind a lot of those narratives versus the story here is interesting because it's kind of like when you try to show what to do by presenting like a counterexample of like what not to do, and or like what actually happens in the world and how that's bad. But I don't think that it is as compelling as exploring the moral ambiguity of roles of power and bureaucracy and abuse of those things. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I rated the anthology 3 stars in all because there were some stories that were good, but a lot of them didn't really engage me. And I think that if you're like a proper horror fan, this book will also be disappointing to you. I think I've seen people talk about how they don't really enjoy this book as readers of horror, and that makes sense to me because it really, I don't think, is trying to be horrific as much as it fits into these elements of dystopian and kind of strange and fantastical, bringing the historical and the present and the future together thing that Jordan Peele is definitely interested in. And it has, like, it features so many authors that are so important in the speculative fiction SFF world who are producing some really great work. And yeah, I'm glad the anthology exists, but it's interesting that it's getting kind of mixed reviews and a lot of negative ones from what I understand, because I see its merits, but I also see how people wouldn't really enjoy it. So yeah, alright, and the next book that I read in February was, and I'm holding this upside down, I think. Okay, Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. I read this initially in 2020, but I reread this now for a class, and I wrote an essay about it, actually comparing it to another book that I'm talking about in this video, probably if I get to it in this wrap up. And if you'd like to read it, I might post it on the Substack I have with the Lavender Menace, my podcast. Let me know if you're interested. It's talking about like jobs and capitalism and the role that it plays in this book in some ways. I think Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer is a cult classic at this point for sci-fi heads and even in like literary fiction enjoyers, speculative fiction. It's Jeff Vandermeer, like, major name in that world. And I think this, like, short novel in the Southern Reach trilogy, which I don't know whether I would want to read the next books. Maybe I will. Maybe I will this month. Who knows? It's strange. It's off-putting. It's about 4 female scientists / there's a biologist who's our main character, an anthropologist, and then a psychologist, and I think a surveyor or something like that. They go out into Area X, which is sort of this encroaching, very weird ecosystem off the coast somewhere, or like near. I don't think it's ever it's never specified where Area X actually is within like sort of the US vaguely, because there's some sort of governmental organization and the military operations are involved. But I've always, and let me know if you read this and like where you think Area X is, but I've always envisioned it to be like off of Florida or like in the Florida area. I don't know why, but I kind of just envisioned that. But honestly, I think the movie is a good adaptation of this novel in a lot of ways, and it's really weird and unsettling, and it kind of gets the vibe of this book across while making it more action and horror vibes. And I think the way that this book gives us imagery, but sort of also lacks imagery at the same time of what the experience of going into Area X is, like really is interesting and compelling. The world that it constructs is so lush and vivid, yet we don't really know. We know some parts of what it looks like, but we don't know what the weirdest stuff of it can look like. And I think it kind of shows how it's really impossible to write about experiences that don't exist, and yet we do. And it's really, I think, like the imagery of this book really conveys that well. I mean, there is a lot of just mystery behind like what the hell is going on here. And our main character, from the perspective of which we are reading, she talks about how she's really there because she wants to figure out what happened to her husband. He went on this mission and he came back and he was like very weird, a different version of himself. And so she wants to know like really what the fuck is going on. So we also see like the way that she came into being, how she became a biologist, why she's a biologist, what she loves about that work, and her relationship with her husband. It's pretty interesting. I think like it's packs a lot in a short novel, and the writing style is also this sort of distanced and removed sense of just alienation that really comes across, because not only are you in this totally alien environment and you're submerged into it as the reader and as the main characters who go through this experience, these characters themselves feel deeply alienated. And I think like that is what makes the writing of this really interesting. I think when I initially read it, because I wasn't, looking at it and analyzing it for a class or anything, and now I have like notes and stuff throughout. I think that my first time reading it through, I rated it like 3 stars or something. But now revisiting it, I think it's more of like a 4-star book. I think it's doing something pretty cool and compelling. I feel like if you took a shot every time, like a sip of a drink every time I said the word compelling in one of my YouTube videos, you would die. But anyways, I liked it, and I'm still considering whether I should read the next couple books in the series. Let me know if you think I should continue with this trilogy in the comments. Okay, the next book that I read was The Between by Tananarive Due. I rated this book 3.5 stars. I thought that the horror element of this novel was interesting because a lot of it is about our main character who runs a charity or organization that helps addicts. I think it's set in Miami, and the Miami world of this book feels as suffocating as I imagine it is in the humidity and heat of the summer. I think this book is set during the summer as well. And basically our main character, he is a family man. His wife is a politician in the area. They're sort of like a well-established middle-class black family, and he has 2 children that he really loves, but he is kind of perhaps straying from his path because he might be starting to cheat on his wife for some reason. He feels really unsettled and weird. The first chapter of this book opens on a scene from his childhood and the strangeness of the world between like life and death, and perhaps revival from death, family histories and family trauma and lore, and what is passed down and what we don't remember. And so our main character, he starts getting like hypnotherapy because he can't sleep, and it's really affecting his like mood and work life and family life. He can't sleep through the night, and then when he does, he has these terrible dreams. He's plagued with these terrible dreams and visions, and he's so anxious and deeply unsettled about it, and he's very much in denial of anything potentially supernatural happening because, he's like a rational man who's very successful, And so he like doesn't want to be like going crazy or something, but things really seem to be happening. Things really seem to be going crazy for him. And so we sort of follow the course of a lot of elements of his life unraveling, him trying to keep it together, him trying to understand what the hell is going on with him and why he's going through this shit. And I think that it was interesting, but it kind of like, as stories and scenes devolved and the path of the narrative moved forward, it kind of decreased in interest to me after maybe the midpoint or 2/3 of the book. And I thought the ending wasn't that satisfying or climactic for all the stuff that was happening throughout. And I thought that the scenes of his earlier life, his childhood versus the world that he created for himself, I wish that was perhaps explored more, because I think that that could have touched on some of more of the themes that this book is trying to explore, from what I understand. But I thought it was pretty good. I think like if you like the way that when something speculative touches, or something weird and science fiction-y touches, and horrific and horror genre-esque touches the life of someone grounded in reality in a realistic world and setting, if you like the way those things really come together in the way that, for example, like horror movies often do, you would enjoy this. I think it was successful at accomplishing that goal of being a horror story that isn't so out there, I guess, that it doesn't feel like it couldn't happen. It is very possible that there is someone out there who is married to a successful politician wife and who's unsatisfied with his life, and he keeps on having these dreams and nightmares, and living nightmares as well, or conscious nightmares and like visions and things like that. I think that is a strength of the novel, is the way that it plays with the realism of the setting and the world and these characters, and the unsettled nature of what is going on to these characters and in this book, and the way that our main character like keeps on having false memories. He's like, oh, I did that, right? And everyone around him was like, no, you didn't. And he's like, no, but I swear to God, I did that. And he was like, they're all like, what interaction? Everyone around him is deeply concerned for him, because they're all like, dude, are you okay? Like, something seems off. And I think that after a while, I felt that it was getting a bit repetitive, or maybe just like not as satisfying, I guess. So I kind of wanted to shake him and be like, dude, you need to take seriously and heed the warnings of like a fucking like psychic or something. Like, get it together. Like, he's friends with his like therapist, the marriage counselor, from when he and his wife went to seek counseling. And he is like really begging him to the therapist and the psychologist to like help him through this, but the psychologist is like, well, we're friends now already, so I can't really treat my friends as patients. So, and I'm like, dude, just like see the other therapist, see the psychic, take it seriously, work through your shit, and hopefully your demons will rest. At a certain point, I was just getting frustrated, you know? But nonetheless, it was good, and I would recommend it. 3.5 stars. Pick it up if any of that sounds interesting to you. Next book that I read was another poetry collection, which, again, I'm not really into poetry. I don't know why I decided to pick this up, but I'm glad I did. It's called Daylight by Roya Marsh. It talks about, she talks about her own experiences being a Black woman, and specifically a Black butch lesbian and survivor of sexual assault and abuse. The way that she deals with these things and these identities, and the violence that she faces for these experiences and through these experiences. And I thought that the introduction, which was her obviously introducing the poems to follow and the sort of essay-like text, was really compelling and interesting. I thought that the poems themselves dipped its toe into some elements of originality in form and texture and storytelling, but it wasn't anything like I hadn't seen before necessarily, I don't think, but it really has this empowering and strong sense of self and voice that comes through. So yeah, I rated it like 3 stars. I thought that it had a really strong feminist and Black political messaging to it. And I think that Roya Marsh really got a lot of what she needed to say in this book and in these poems, and I find that commendable and beautiful. So yeah, pick it up if you're into contemporary poetry that has the vibe and sense of like slam poetry. The next book I read in February was A Burst of Light by Audre Lorde, which is an essay collection from different points in Audre Lorde's life, I believe. And she's writing about being diagnosed with cancer, living with cancer, being a poet, a writer, an activist, a feminist, and a mother, a partner. The way that this compilation of Audre Lorde texts works really shines a burst of light, onto her philosophy and her ethos as a writer and as a woman and as a person, as a feminist, as a lesbian. The way she talks about issues contemporary to her time as a second wave feminist, talking about the ways that we can bring together women across barriers, the really topical things of the time, right? Like the way that these feminist movements was trying to bridge sort of divides between black and white women, lesbians and straight women, how to contend with these realities and try to form a feminist movement and struggle, and a global one too, South African apartheid and fighting and combating that, and her children, and raising her kids in an interracial household, raising her kids to be activists and strong people on their own. I think the way that she is proud and yet humble with her accomplishments and her experiences throughout these essays, and the way that she writes, oh, I was invited to speak at this conference and all this. I think like this is the book that you should read if you have read things like, which I have, Sister Outsider, her essay collection, and like which includes The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, I think is the piece, and Zami, her biomythography. Because I like read that, I was like, okay, I need to tap into this, and I did. I think that it really articulates the things that Audre Lorde is talking about and the ethos that Lorde has regarding community and like self-care. I think the way that she has written about and talked about community and self-care has gotten really bastardized, I guess, in pop cultural imaginations and pop culture history, pop culture sociology of understanding feminist and black and queer histories and movements, and misappropriated and placed into these contemporary contexts that aren't as radical and don't really flesh out the importance that of the role that these ideas played in her time, and why and where these concepts originated from in the first place. Like, I think people oftentimes will take self-care as a word to justify their own self-destructive or destructive in general behaviors, when really what Lorde is writing about from the context of self-care was really about, surviving cancer and battling through this disease, and making her life and making her life political in carving out a path for her to pursue the things that are so important to her as an activist, poet, feminist, lesbian, mother. It's the strength and it's the care and the compassion that you work to extend to yourself and others in the midst of something like having cancer, like your death at your door, that really indicates the care and community that's involved in what Lorde is writing about. I think that more people who invoke Lorde's words should actually read her, or concepts that are ripped from Lorde really should read her. I think that people who are, reading like bell hooks all about love should tap into Audre Lorde, because of the way that she is more specific, I guess, or like she really specifies her involvement in her role and her place within movements and her views on culture and student movements at the time, and all these things. They're like, of course, super relevant contemporarily. So I would recommend you read this book if you have read some of her other texts. The next book that I read was Severance by Ling, and this was another reread. I again read it for a class, and I thought that this book was really interesting and compelling, especially the second time around. The way that brand names and specific objects fill this character's world, the way that money, commodity, grief, family, love plays out, and amidst this millennial experiencing the zombie apocalypse while she continues to go to the office every day, and the way that she documents all of this through her NY Ghost, the blog that she posts her photography on as the city is collapsing around her, as more and more people become prey to Shen fever as it spreads around the globe. I think this was a hot commodity in the early days of the pandemic, which is when I first picked this up, 4 years ago at this point. But rereading this and revisiting it has given me a new appreciation for it when, studied in the context of like a class. And this is actually the book that I wrote in comparison to or in relationship to Annihilation, and the way that our main characters' jobs sort of have a relationship to their lives and the worlds of these books. So if you do want to read that paper, which I got an A on, thank you very much. Let me know in the comments. But anyways, Severance, I think a lot of things have been said about this. Most people know what it's about because it's a hot TikTok book, I think, from what I hear. And I think that it does something really interesting with examining the process of grief while also portraying the way that a cult can emerge from disasters or cults in general. The way that this book alternates between past and present, her present being joining this group led by a religious fanatic named Bob, and those scenes and all of that feels very like unsettling, of course. And the way that they are scrounging up supplies in the apocalypse of this world versus seeing that world before it hit apocalypse levels and before it became what it was. Our main character going through both of these things, watching as people succumb to this disease all around her. The object world of this book is so interesting because there's so many brand names and specific products and all these things that are so tied to like capitalism and the market, the way that she works in a specific part of the publishing sector with the boring bullshit, with an aspiration to work in the art book section with the cool art girls. Like, I think so much of this book that deals with growing up also like Chinese American and that element of identity is and sort of the isolation and disconnect from family and other community, the boyfriend, the boss, the office, New York, all these worlds and characters feel kind of true to life in this textured way that I think Ling Ma does well in this novel. So, 4-star read. And then the final book that I read in February, which was probably my favorite book that I read in February, was Daddy Was a Number Runner by Louise Meriwether. This book, I think, is a slept-on, should-be classic. It follows the perspective of this, 11 or 12-year-old girl who lives, I think, in Harlem in the 1930s during the midst of the Great Depression. So in her community, we get the perspective of a young girl experiencing the poverty and the destitution that Black communities and families in New York were facing during this time and the hardships of it. But through the voice of this child, it is really funny and fun at many times, even as horrific things are happening all around her, because it's coming, we're understanding this through her eyes and her voice. It is so good. And how she gets sent on these errands to run uptown for her mom and to go borrow money, and how her dad is a piano player, but really his job, as the title suggests, a number runner. So there was a numbers lottery in the early 20th century, I think into later parts of the 20th century in New York, where the gambling circuit around betting on numbers and the hope to win $100 that week or $50 the next week or whatever, keeps this community afloat in a lot of ways. And of course it's illegal, but the way that our main character's dad doesn't have a job because it's the Great Depression and is scraping by while her brothers are ditching school and one of them gets involved in sort of a gang, I think, all through the voice and perspective in the eyes of this child who also faces a lot of violence, from street harassment to being abused and molested in various ways. I think one of the most vivid parts of this book is when she is interacting with the Jewish baker, or the Jewish bakery downstairs, the relationship that is there between the baker who owns the bakery and this family, how they get sort of the free, expired almost products for the day, the class and race relations that are involved in this book, the way that this social worker who comes in kind of like terrorizes their lives, and yeah, like it's the way that her mother works so hard and it keeps on insisting on the fact that she wants to go work and go stand in the line in the Bronx where white women would drive up from the suburbs and hire black or Puerto Rican maids to do a day's worth of cleaning for like a flat rate of like 30 cents an hour or something like that. This was a really common phenomenon through the 30s up till I think the 50s. And yeah, especially during the Great Depression, it was like this is one of the only options for black women during this time for employment. And so her mother insists on trying to get that sort of job so she can bring in more money for the family. But her dad is a patriarchal figure, and especially in the sense of insisting that his wife shouldn't work because he should be able to provide for the family. But obviously, he's not providing for the family because it's kind of impossible for him at that moment. And at the same time, it's like basically no one else in their community is doing much better. The way that they all help each other in like helping, when the electricity gets turned off, doing like the jumper cable from the generator trick or whatever. It is, yeah, it's beautiful, and it shines with the humor and the dynamics of an 11-year-old girl with her best friend and this 11-year-old feeling skinny and ugly. It was really beautiful and funny and compulsively readable. I think more people should read this. It was really good. I liked it a lot. A really excellent and well-crafted novel. So I've been talking for a while now, and I just finished all the books, wrapping up all the books that I read in February. So thank you for sticking around if you're all the way to the end of this video. I will be back again with my March wrap-up and my April wrap-up. Maybe those will two be in one video. We'll see. But anyways, that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you in my next one, hopefully. Alright, bye!